The wine was still warm in my glass when my son squeezed my hand under the table. 3 pulses. Slow, deliberate. A signal we invented when he was 7 years old, back when his Uncle Douglas could trap a second grader in a hallway for 45 minutes talking about municipal water systems. We hadn't used it in over a decade. He used it tonight, right after the woman sitting across from me. The woman who had been sleeping in his apartment for 6 weeks. The woman who said she loved him. Finished explaining why the best investment returns exist specifically in places regulators can't see. My name is Gloria Whitfield. I spent 33 years inside financial crime, and I was looking at one right now. If you're interested in this topic, hit the like button, subscribe, and type interested in the comments, and I will give you a heart. I want to tell you that I saw it coming from the moment she walked through my front door. I want to tell you that 33 years of working financial crime made me some kind of human lie detector. That the moment Alicia Drummond smiled at me across my dining room table, I clocked her for exactly what she was. But that would be a lie. And the one thing I've never been able to stomach, not in a courtroom, not in an interrogation room, not even at my own dinner table, is a lie dressed up as confidence. The truth is she was good. She was so good that for the first 40 minutes of that evening, I was simply enjoying my wine. That's how you know someone is operating at a genuinely dangerous level. They don't trigger your alarm. They disarm it before you even know it was armed. She had come in carrying a bottle of Pinot Noir she'd selected herself. Not grabbed off a shelf, selected, because she'd asked Nathan 2 weeks earlier what I liked, and he'd told her I preferred something from the Niagara Peninsula, and she had gone out and found exactly that. She set it on the counter with both hands, label facing out, and said she wasn't sure if she'd gotten it right, but she'd done her research. I remember thinking that was a charming thing to say. I remember thinking my son had found someone thoughtful. I was already inside the frame before the picture was even hung. Dinner was my pot roast, the one I've been making since Nathan was in grade school, carrots and parsnips, and a broth I start the night before. My husband, Ronald, was traveling for work, which meant it was just the 3 of us, and there was something about that intimacy, the smaller table, the quieter house, that I think she had also calculated. Alicia sat across from me and she asked questions. Not the polite surface questions people ask when they're filling silence. Real questions. She asked me how I got into financial regulation, what the most complicated case I'd ever worked looked like from the inside, whether I thought white-collar crime was under-sentenced in Canada. She listened to my answers the way people listen when they actually want to know. And I gave her more than I normally would because she made it feel like a conversation rather than an interview. Nathan was watching us from his end of the table. I know his face the way you only know the face of someone you raised from nothing. Every expression, every micro shift, every version of the smile he gives when something is fine versus the smile he gives when he is managing something carefully. He was managing something. I could see it in the way he laughed half a second after the rest of us, in the way he kept his hands visible on the table like a man who didn't want to fidget. I filed it without naming it. Some part of my brain opened a folder and put that observation inside and closed it again. I've learned to trust that part. She brought up her work naturally. The way you bring up a subject when you've practiced bringing it up naturally until the rehearsal disappears. She described herself as a private wealth facilitator, and she said it the way people say a title they've spent time with, comfortably, without defensiveness, as though it had never once occurred to her that anyone might ask a follow-up question. I asked one anyway. I asked her how that differed from a licensed investment advisor. She smiled, open and patient, and said that the distinction was mostly about the kinds of opportunities she worked with, that her clients were high net worth individuals who needed access to structures that sat outside the traditional banking framework, that she helped them move capital into places where it could actually grow. She said the word, actually, like the entire traditional investment industry, was a slow leak in a tire you'd been ignoring for years. I asked her what kind of regulatory oversight those structures carried. And here is where I want you to pay attention, because this is the moment I'm going to show you exactly how a professional does it. She did not hesitate. She did not deflect. She leaned forward slightly, just slightly, and she said that was actually one of the advantages of working outside traditional frameworks. Less regulatory friction meant faster movement of capital. Faster movement of capital was where the real returns lived. She said it warmly, like she was giving me something generous, like she was letting me in on a kindness the rest of the world hadn't caught up to yet. She said it like less oversight was a feature. I said, less regulatory friction. And I said it back to her pleasantly, the way you repeat something when you want to hold it up to the light without making it obvious. That's what you're doing. Exactly, she said. And she smiled again, and it was a very good smile. Now, let me ask you something, and I genuinely want to know, where in the world are you watching this from right now? Because what I'm about to tell you next is the part that changes everything about how this evening actually ended, and it starts with what happened underneath that table. Nathan's hand found mine at 8:42 in the evening. I know the time because I had just glanced at the clock above the stove when I felt it. 3 squeezes. Not nervous, not desperate. Deliberate, the way he used to do it when he was small and needed me to know something without saying it out loud. I looked at my son across the table, and he looked back at me with the same steady eyes he'd had his entire life. He wasn't asking me to rescue him. He was telling me he was already in the water and trusting me to know what to do next. 33 years of training had prepared me for exactly this moment. What I found when I started pulling on that thread was something far larger, far darker, and far more dangerous than any of us had sitting at that dinner table expected. After they left that night, I stood at the kitchen sink for a long time without turning the water on. Just standing there with my hands on the edge of the counter and the house quiet around me, and the particular kind of stillness that settles in a room after people have been in it and then aren't anymore. Ronald was still traveling. The dishes were done. The leftover pot roast was wrapped and in the refrigerator. Everything in my kitchen looked exactly the way it always looked, and yet something had shifted in the air the way air shifts before a storm you can't see yet, but your body already knows is coming. I have felt that shift before. I felt it in 2009 sitting across a boardroom table from a man in a very good suit who was explaining a real estate syndication structure with such fluency and such warmth that 3 of the 5 people in that room were nodding along before he'd even gotten to the numbers. I felt it then, and I broke him apart over the following 4 months document by document until there was nothing left of the structure he'd built except a criminal record and a list of victims trying to recover what they'd lost. I felt it again standing at my kitchen sink at 10:47 at night with the wine glasses drying in the rack, and Alicia Drummond's voice still sitting somewhere behind my sternum like a splinter that hadn't broken the skin yet. Nathan had forwarded me the email before he even got back to his apartment. 17 pages. I printed it at my desk, all 17 pages, and I sat down at the kitchen table with a yellow legal pad and a pen. And I went through it the way I was trained to go through documents, slowly, linearly, treating every sentence as a potential site of concealment. The letterhead said Lakeshore Private Capital Corporation. The address listed was on West Georgia Street in Vancouver, which is a real street in a real city with real buildings on it, which is exactly the kind of address you choose when you want something to feel verifiable without actually being verifiable. The font was clean. The layout was professional. The watermark was subtle and correctly placed. Someone had spent real time making this document look like the kind of document a person with money would feel comfortable signing. That matters. That is not an accident. That is craft. The performance chart on page 4 showed 8 consecutive years of returns, ranging between 16 and 22% annually. 8 years. Consistent. The line on the graph moved the way lines on graphs move in the dreams of people who don't know enough about finance to know that no legitimate private credit fund produces that kind of consistency across an 8-year window that included 2020. No auditor was cited. Not on page 4, not in the disclosure section at the back, not anywhere in the 17 pages. There was a reference to something called the Lakeshore Capital Investor Assurance Program, described as a proprietary protection mechanism for committed investors, and the document said full details were available in a supplementary disclosure package. The supplementary disclosure package was not attached. There was no link. There was no contact name for requesting it. It simply existed as a reference to a thing that the document assured you existed, with no way to confirm that it did. The subscription minimum was $25,000. There was a preferred allocation tier available for commitments above $100,000, which came with priority access to what the document called flagship credit facilities and an enhanced return structure. $100,000. I wrote that number on my legal pad and underlined it twice. Then I wrote Nathan's name next to it and the number 240,000, which was the total sitting in his RRSP, and I looked at those two numbers side by side for a moment before I kept reading. The fund's stated strategy involved private credit facilities secured by physical assets. That phrase, secured by physical assets, is the kind of phrase that sounds like a guarantee until you notice that nowhere in the document does it specify what the physical assets actually are. No schedule, no property descriptions, no collateral list. Just the phrase itself, floating there, anchoring nothing, promising everything, meaning whatever a person needed it to mean in the moment they were deciding whether to trust it. I pulled up the West Georgia address on my laptop at midnight. What came back was a business registration service operating out of a shared commercial building. The kind of service that charges $40 a month to receive your mail and lists their address as your registered location. No office, no staff, no physical presence beyond a mailbox with a corporate name on it. I have seen this particular setup in 11 separate fraud cases across my career. 11. It is not a coincidence, and it is not a cost-cutting measure, and it is not something a legitimate private capital firm with 8 years of performance history and high net worth clients does because it's convenient. It is a ghost address on a ghost building for a ghost company, and whoever built Lakeshore Private Capital Corporation had built it to disappear cleanly when the time came. I wrote two names on my legal pad. Sandra Okafor, who had run white-collar investigations for the RCMP before moving to the Ontario Securities Commission, and Paul Trevick, a forensic accountant I'd worked alongside on Crown cases in Hamilton for the better part of a decade. I texted them both at 12:38 in the morning, not because I needed confirmation of what I already knew. I knew what this was. I texted them because what I didn't know yet was the full shape of it, how long it had been running, how many people were inside it, and most critically, whether Alicia Drummond was working alone. Because in my experience, operators this polished, this patient, this precise in their construction rarely are. And what Sandra told me the next morning before 9 o'clock changed the entire architecture of what I thought I was dealing with. Sandra called me at 8:15 the next morning, and I knew from the first half second of silence, after I said her name, that what she had found was not small. Sandra Okafor is not a woman who pauses. In 20 years of working alongside her across financial crime investigations that span 3 provinces and involve some of the most structurally complex fraud I have ever encountered, I have never once heard her take a breath before speaking that she didn't need to take. She took one that morning. Just one. And in that one breath, I felt the case expand around me the way a room expands when someone turns on a light you didn't know was missing. "Give me what you have," I said. And she did. Alicia Drummond was real. That was the first thing Sandra confirmed, and I want you to understand why that mattered, because in fraud investigation, the first thing you verify is always identity. Because the most sophisticated operators don't just build fake companies, they build fake people. Entire digital identities with employment histories and professional profiles and social footprints that look lived in until you press on them and they collapse. Alicia Drummond did not collapse. 34 years old, born and raised in Sudbury, business degree from Wilfrid Laurier University, graduated with honors. The leftover pot roast was wrapped and in the refrigerator. Everything in my kitchen looked exactly the way it always looked. And yet something had shifted in the air the way air shifts before a storm you can't see yet, but your body already knows is coming. I have felt that shift before. I felt it in 2009 sitting across a boardroom table from a man in a very good suit who was explaining a real estate syndication structure with such fluency and such warmth that 3 of the 5 people in that room were nodding along before he'd even gotten to the numbers. I felt it then, and I broke him apart over the following 4 months document by document until there was nothing left of the structure he'd built except a criminal record and a list of victims trying to recover what they'd lost. I felt it again standing at my kitchen sink at 10:47 at night with the wine glasses drying in the rack and Alicia Drummond's voice still sitting somewhere behind my sternum like a splinter that hadn't broken the skin yet. Nathan had forwarded me the email before he even got back to his apartment. 17 pages. I printed it at my desk, all 17 pages, and I sat down at the kitchen table with a yellow legal pad and a pen, and I went through it the way I was trained to go through documents, slowly, linearly, treating every sentence as a potential site of concealment. The letterhead said Lakeshore Private Capital Corporation. The address listed was on West Georgia Street in Vancouver, which is a real street in a real city with real buildings on it, which is exactly the kind of address you choose when you want something to feel verifiable without actually being verifiable. The font was clean. The layout was professional. The watermark was subtle and correctly placed. Someone had spent real time making this document look like the kind of document a person with money would feel comfortable signing. That matters. That is not an accident. That is craft. The performance chart on page 4 showed 8 consecutive years of returns, ranging between 16 and 22% annually. 8 years. Consistent. The line on the graph moved the way lines on graphs move in the dreams of people who don't know enough about finance to know that no legitimate private credit fund produces that kind of consistency across an 8-year window that included 2020. No auditor was cited. Not on page 4, not in the disclosure section at the back. Not anywhere in the 17 pages. There was a reference to something called the Lakeshore Capital Investor Assurance Program, described as a proprietary protection mechanism for committed investors, and the document said full details were available in a supplementary disclosure package. The supplementary disclosure package was not attached. There was no link. There was no contact name for requesting it. It simply existed as a reference to a thing that the document assured you existed, with no way to confirm that it did. The subscription minimum was $25,000. There was a preferred allocation tier available for commitments above $100,000, which came with priority access to what the document called flagship credit facilities and an enhanced return structure. $100,000. I wrote that number on my legal pad and underlined it twice. Then I wrote Nathan's name next to it and the number 240,000, which was the total sitting in his RRSP, and I looked at those two numbers side by side for a moment before I kept reading. The fund's stated strategy involved private credit facilities secured by physical assets. That phrase, secured by physical assets, is the kind of phrase that sounds like a guarantee until you notice that nowhere in the document does it specify what the physical assets actually are. No schedule, no property descriptions, no collateral list. Just the phrase itself, floating there, anchoring nothing, promising everything, meaning whatever a person needed it to mean in the moment they were deciding whether to trust it. I pulled up the West Georgia address on my laptop at midnight. What came back was a business registration service operating out of a shared commercial building. The kind of service that charges $40 a month to receive your mail and lists their address as your registered location. No office, no staff, no physical presence beyond a mailbox with a corporate name on it. I have seen this particular setup in 11 separate fraud cases across my career. 11. It is not a coincidence, and it is not a cost-cutting measure, and it is not something a legitimate private capital firm with 8 years of performance history and high net worth clients does because it's convenient. It is a ghost address on a ghost building for a ghost company, and whoever built Lakeshore Private Capital Corporation had built it to disappear cleanly when the time came. I wrote 2 names on my legal pad. Sandra Okafor, who had run white-collar investigations for the RCMP before moving to the Ontario Securities Commission, and Paul Trevick, a forensic accountant I'd worked alongside on Crown cases in Hamilton for the better part of a decade. I texted them both at 12:38 in the morning, not because I needed confirmation of what I already knew. I knew what this was. I texted them because what I didn't know yet was the full shape of it, how long it had been running, how many people were inside it, and most critically, whether Alicia Drummond was working alone. Because in my experience, operators this polished, this patient, this precise in their construction rarely are. And what Sandra told me the next morning before 9 o'clock changed the entire architecture of what I thought I was dealing with. Sandra called me at 8:15 the next morning, and I knew from the first half second of silence, after I said her name, that what she had found was not small. Sandra Okafor is not a woman who pauses. In 20 years of working alongside her across financial crime investigations that span 3 provinces and involve some of the most structurally complex fraud I have ever encountered, I have never once heard her take a breath before speaking that she didn't need to take. She took one that morning. Just one. And in that one breath, I felt the case expand around me the way a room expands when someone turns on a light you didn't know was missing. Give me what you have, I said. And she did. Alicia Drummond was real. That was the first thing Sandra confirmed, and I want you to understand why that mattered, because in fraud investigation, the first thing you verify is always identity. Because the most sophisticated operators don't just build fake companies, they build fake people. Entire digital identities with employment histories and professional profiles and social footprints that look lived in until you press on them and they collapse. Alicia Drummond did not collapse. 34 years old, born and raised in Sudbury. Business degree from Wilfrid Laurier University. Graduated with honors. 3 years of legitimate employment at a wealth management firm in Mississauga. A real firm. Regulated. Established. The kind of place that takes compliance seriously and keeps detailed records of everything its advisors do and say and recommend. She had been good at that job too. That was in the file. What was also in the file was the reason she no longer worked there. The firm had filed a complaint with the Financial Services Regulatory Authority of Ontario in the 3rd year of her employment. The complaint was categorized as inappropriate relationship with the client. The client was a widower, 68 years old, recently retired, no children living in the same city. The kind of person whose social world had contracted sharply after his wife died and who was, by every measure that a predator uses to assess a target, emotionally available and financially exposed. Alicia had spent 7 months building a relationship with him. Not a purely professional relationship. A warm one. The kind where she remembered the names of his grandchildren and asked about his garden and made him feel, I would imagine, like someone had decided he was worth knowing again. And then, at the 7-month mark, she had recommended he move $70,000 out of his registered accounts and into a private fund that carried no registration with any securities regulator in any province. The fund did not exist in any verifiable form. The $70,000 moved, and then it was gone. The firm caught it during a routine audit, not because the client reported it. He was too ashamed. Too embarrassed to tell anyone that the warmth he'd felt had been a tool being used against him with surgical precision. The firm filed the complaint. The FSRA reviewed it. The file was closed without criminal charges because the client refused to cooperate with investigators. He told them he just wanted it to be over. He told them he didn't want his family to know. I sat with that for a long moment after Sandra finished telling me. Not because it surprised me. I have sat across from enough victims of romance-adjacent fraud to know that shame is the mechanism that protects the operator more reliably than any legal strategy ever could. Victims don't come forward because coming forward means admitting that the affection felt real, that they believed it, that they let themselves be known by someone who was only learning them in order to use what they learned. That admission feels like a second loss on top of the first one. So they go quiet. And the operator moves to the next city and the next target and the next carefully selected emotional opening and does it again, slightly refined, slightly more confident because nothing went wrong the last time. Nothing went wrong because no one said anything. I wrote the word Mississauga on my legal pad and drew a line connecting it to the word Lakeshore, and I looked at that line for a moment. This was not her first fund. This was not her first widower. This was not even her first city. What Sandra had found was a dry run. A smaller version of the same play, rehearsed on a man too embarrassed to fight back, refined, and then brought here, to my city, to my son's apartment, to my dining room table with a bottle of Niagara Pinot Noir selected specifically because someone had done the research. Now I need to stop for just a second, because I want to ask you something sincerely. If this story is hitting you the way I think it's hitting you, if you're watching this and thinking about someone in your life who might be inside something they can't fully see yet, go ahead and share this with them. Not tomorrow. Right now while you're watching. Because the next thing Sandra told me is the part that made my blood go genuinely cold, and it's the part that revealed this was not a two-person operation. Lakeshore Private Capital Corporation had a name attached to it that Sandra had flagged across 2 other provincial investigations. A name that had never been charged. A name that kept appearing at the edges of collapsed private funds the way a shadow appears at the edge of a frame. Present enough to be real, positioned carefully enough to be deniable. Alicia Drummond was the face. She was the warmth and the wine and the carefully memorized details about what a retired investigator preferred to drink. But someone had built the structure she was operating inside. Someone had designed the 17-page subscription agreement with the clean fonts and the ghost address and the missing auditor and the phantom assurance program. And that person had done it before. What Paul Trevick found when I read him the document over the phone the following morning confirmed not just that the fund was fraudulent, but that whoever had written it had written documents exactly like it at least twice before and had learned, each time, precisely which details to hide. Paul Trevick called me at 8:45 that same morning, and I had the 17 pages spread across my kitchen table with my legal pad open beside them and a second cup of coffee going cold at my elbow because I had forgotten to drink it. Paul has a voice that doesn't change register when he finds something significant. That is one of the things that makes him exceptional at what he does. A lesser forensic accountant gets excited when the numbers reveal something. Paul gets quieter. The quieter Paul gets, the worse the thing he has found. He was very quiet that morning. I read him the document section by section, starting with the fund overview, moving through the performance history, the investment strategy, the subscription terms, and when I got to the asset-backed security section, the part that described private credit facilities secured by physical assets, he stopped me. "Read that again," he said. I read it again. He was silent for long enough that I pulled the phone away from my ear to check the call was still connected. Then he said, "Gloria, there is no schedule." I said, "I know." He said, "No, I need you to understand what I mean when I say that. In every legitimate private credit fund I have reviewed in 23 years of forensic accounting, every single one, there is a collateral schedule attached to the subscription agreement. It lists the physical assets. It describes them. It assigns values to them. It tells an investor exactly what their money is theoretically secured against, so that if the fund defaults, there is a documented basis for recovery claims. This document has none of that. It uses the language of asset-backed lending without providing a single asset. It is a frame," he said, "without a painting. You could hang anything in it or nothing at all. And when the money was gone and the investors came looking, there would be no documented asset to point to, no collateral to pursue. No recovery mechanism of any kind, because the mechanism was never real. It was always just the description of a mechanism, dressed in professional language, formatted to look like the real thing to anyone who didn't know exactly what the real thing looked like. I wrote the word collateral on my legal pad and drew a circle around it, and then I asked Paul the question I already knew the answer to, but needed him to say out loud. Could this have been an oversight, I said. A documentation error. Something missing by accident rather than design. He made a sound that in 20 years of working with Paul Trevick, I have learned to recognize as the forensic accountant equivalent of a laugh. "Gloria," he said, "the rest of this document is meticulous. The disclosure language in the back section is dense and technically constructed. Someone who understood securities law, or who had access to someone who did, wrote the protective language in this agreement with precision. The collateral schedule is not missing because someone forgot. It is missing because whoever drafted this document made a deliberate choice to omit it. Because a real collateral schedule would require real assets. Real assets would require real documentation. Real documentation would require a real company with a real structure that could be traced, audited, and verified. There is no real company here. There never was. This fund was built to take money in one direction and provide nothing in return except paperwork that looked convincing long enough for the window to close. I thanked Paul and told him I would be in touch, and I sat at my kitchen table for a moment with my hands flat on the 17 pages, and I thought about the widower in Mississauga who had been too ashamed to press charges. I thought about the $70,000 that had moved through a structure just like this one and disappeared into a layered financial architecture designed specifically to resist recovery. I thought about Nathan's $240,000 sitting in an RRSP that Alicia Drummond had been methodically steering him toward for weeks. And I thought about the end of the month deadline in the subscription agreement. And I thought about what 72 hours meant to someone who knew how to move money fast through accounts designed to drain and close. I called Sandra back. I told her what Paul had said. She already knew most of it, but she listened the way Sandra always listens, completely without interrupting, storing everything. Then she told me the part she had been holding back until she had confirmed it through a second channel. The name that kept appearing at the edges of collapsed private funds across 2 provincial investigations was a man named Derek Solano, 51 years old, no criminal record, a registered mortgage broker in British Columbia with a clean public profile and a business address in Kelowna that was, unlike the West Georgia ghost address, a real office with real staff and a real telephone number that a real person answered. Derek Solano had never been charged with anything. He had never been named in a civil proceeding. His name appeared in the investigative notes of 3 separate collapse fund cases across Alberta and British Columbia, always at a distance, always connected through a layer of intermediary corporate structures that were dissolved before investigators could build a complete chain of documentation. He was the architect. He built the frames. He wrote the subscription agreements or had them written to his specifications. He selected the operators, trained them, positioned them in cities where he had no visible presence, and took his percentage of whatever moved before the window closed and the structure collapsed. Alicia Drummond was not working alone. She had never been working alone. She was the face of something that had a brain behind it, and that brain had been doing this long enough to know exactly how to stay invisible. Sandra said we needed Nathan. I said I know. She said it had to be a recording. His phone, his conversation, his voice on the audio asking questions and letting her answer fully. In Ontario, you can record a conversation you are a party to without disclosure, and that recording is admissible. We needed Alicia on tape describing the fund, naming the return figures, providing the wire transfer details, asking Nathan to commit. We needed her to build the case herself in her own words without knowing she was doing it. And we needed it before the end of the month. I drove to Nathan's apartment that afternoon and I told my son everything. Every piece of it. The Mississauga complaint, the widower, the ghost address, the missing collateral, Derek Solano's name at the edges of 3 collapsed funds in 2 provinces. I told him all of it and I watched his face the way I have watched his face his entire life. And what I saw there was not panic and it was not collapse. It was the particular stillness of a person recalibrating around a truth they had already half known and had been waiting for someone to confirm. She told me she loved me, he said. Not angry, just quiet. The way people go quiet when the architecture of something they trusted fully reveals itself to have been, from the very beginning, a controlled demolition. I know, I said. And then I told him what he needed to do next. What happened inside that coffee shop on Thursday afternoon is something I have replayed more times than I can count, not because it went wrong, but because of how precisely, how completely, and how devastatingly it went right. I want to tell you exactly what I told Nathan that evening at his kitchen table, because I think it matters not just as context, but as a window into what it actually takes to sit across from someone who has been systematically dismantling your future while telling you they love you, and hold yourself together well enough to let them finish. I told him to wear a shirt with a front pocket. I told him to open the voice memo app on his phone before he left his apartment, not in the parking lot, not at the table, at home, where his hands were steady and there was no chance of Alicia seeing him navigate his screen. I told him to place the phone in the pocket screen facing inward, which positions the microphone at the correct angle to capture full table conversation without the fabric muffling the audio. I told him to order something and drink it slowly and let her set the pace. I told him that when she began the investment conversation, which she would, because she had already sent the subscription agreement and the month-end deadline was close and she would be feeling the pressure of her own timeline, he needed to ask questions in a neutral tone. Not skeptical, not eager, neutral. The tone of a man who had thought seriously about it and had a few things he wanted to understand before he committed. I told him the single most powerful thing he could do was leave silence after she answered. Not fill it. Not affirm it. Just let it sit. Because people who are selling something, especially people who are selling something they know cannot survive scrutiny, cannot tolerate silence. Silence feels like doubt, and doubt feels like a closing window, and a closing window triggers the instinct to keep talking, to add more detail, to make the picture more vivid and more complete and more incriminating with every additional sentence. Let her talk, I said. The more she talks, the better. He looked at me across his kitchen table with those steady eyes, and he said, I can do that. And I believed him because I had raised him and I knew what he was made of. But I also believed him because I had watched him sit through an entire dinner with a woman who had spent 6 weeks preparing to steal from him, and he had not flinched once. He called her that evening and told her he had been thinking seriously about the subscription agreement and had a few questions he wanted to go through in person before he committed. He said he didn't want to do it over text. She suggested a coffee shop in his neighborhood for Thursday afternoon. The same coffee shop, I later learned, where she had taken him on their third date, which was not an accident. Nothing about Alicia Drummond was an accident. She was returning him to a location loaded with a specific emotional memory at the precise moment she needed him to feel safe and warm and certain. She said it in the tone I had watched her use at my dining room table, unhurried, warm, completely calibrated to give him no reason to feel anything other than cared for. Thursday morning, I drove to Nathan's apartment and we sat together for an hour and I walked him through it one more time. Not because he had forgotten, because repetition under pressure is what separates a person who knows what to do from a person who can actually do it when the moment arrives and their hands want to shake. We went through every likely sequence of the conversation. We went through what to say if she deflected a question. We went through what to say if she asked him directly whether he was ready to commit. We went through the wire transfer question, which was the most critical piece, because Sandra needed Alicia on tape providing the specific account details, the credit union name, the account number, the routing information, the timeline of fund movement. That was the piece that would connect the fraud directly to a financial instrument that investigators could trace and freeze. Without that piece, the recording was strong, but incomplete. With it, it was a case. Nathan nodded through all of it, and when I asked him how he was feeling, he looked out his kitchen window for a moment, and then he looked back at me and said, angry but calm. The kind of calm that comes after you have already decided something, and the deciding is the hardest part, and everything after it is just execution. I drove home and sat with Ronald in the kitchen, and I did not tell him everything because there are things you hold close when an operation is in progress, not out of secrecy, but out of the discipline that 33 years of investigative work builds into you at a cellular level. You do not speak the outcome before it exists. You do not let hope get ahead of evidence. I drank my tea and I watched the clock and I waited. And if you have ever waited for someone you love to walk into a dangerous room, carrying a recording device, and the entire weight of your family's financial future, you know that no amount of professional training fully insulates you from what that waiting feels like. His text came through at 4:17. Done. I have it all. Calling you in 10 minutes. When he called, his voice was steady, but then the way voices get when adrenaline is still leaving a body 1 degree at a time. He told me she had been complete. He told me she had described the fund structure in detail, the return projections, 18 to 22% annually, which is a number so far outside the range of any legitimate investment vehicle that it functions almost as a signature, a marker left by someone too confident in their own performance to realize they had stopped being careful. She had named the intake deadline. She had described the preferred allocation available to him if he committed above $100,000. And then she had provided the wire transfer details, the credit union in British Columbia, the account number. She had told him the fund managers preferred working outside the major banks because of processing speed and that his money would be working for him within 72 hours of the transfer. 72 hours. I knew exactly what 72 hours meant. By the time any investor realized the fund did not exist and the account had been deliberately drained and closed, 72 hours was more than sufficient time to move money through enough layered accounts to make recovery not just difficult, but in many cases structurally impossible. That was the design. That had always been the design. I called Sandra that evening and told her we had the recording. If you think you know someone in your life who needs to hear this story before it's too late for them, share this right now, because what Sandra said when she called me back the next morning at 7:30 and what happened at Nathan's apartment before 8 o'clock on Friday is the part that every single person Alicia Drummond had ever targeted had been waiting for without knowing it was coming. Sandra called me at 7:30 Friday morning, and the first thing she said was, "It's enough," and she said it with the particular flatness of someone who has listened to a recording 3 times in a single night, not because they needed to, but because they wanted to be certain, the way you are certain about something that is going to matter in a courtroom. The way you are certain about something that is going to matter to 8 people who lost money they will never fully recover, and who deserve, at minimum, to watch the person responsible answer for it in a room where the evidence cannot be explained away. She had sent the audio to 2 colleagues at the OSC the previous evening, and they had both come back to her before midnight. The wire transfer details alone were enough to connect Alicia Drummond directly to a British Columbia Credit Union account that Sandra's contacts in the RCMP Financial Crimes Unit had already flagged in connection with one of the collapse fund cases in Alberta. The account had received deposits from 3 other investors before Nathan was ever approached. 3 people who had already transferred money. 3 people whose funds were sitting in an account that had a documented connection to Derek Solano's network of intermediary corporate structures. The moment Nathan's recording provided the account number on tape, in Alicia's own voice, in a conversation she had initiated for the explicit purpose of directing a wire transfer, the chain was complete. Not suggestive, not circumstantial, complete. Sandra said, "We are moving today." And I said, "I know," and there was nothing else either of us needed to say because we had both been in this work long enough to know what today meant and what it was going to look like and what it was going to cost the people in that apartment when it arrived. I did not tell Nathan exactly when it was coming. Sandra had asked me not to, not because she didn't trust him, but because the human body cannot fully conceal the knowledge that something is about to happen, and Alicia was good enough to read that concealment, good enough to feel the shift in an atmosphere that should have been ordinary, good enough to understand in the space of a single wrong look or a single slightly too careful sentence that something had changed and that she needed to move. People like Alicia Drummond do not wait to be certain before they disappear. They feel the edge of exposure the way animals feel weather, and they act on that feeling before the thought is even fully formed. Sandra needed her in the apartment, relaxed, operating on the assumption that Thursday's coffee shop conversation had gone exactly the way she had planned it, and that the month-end deadline was still running in her favor. So Nathan knew something was coming. He just didn't know the hour. He told me later that he had woken up at 5:30 that morning and lain in the dark listening to Alicia breathe beside him and thought about the widower in Mississauga who had been too ashamed to say anything. The man who had let $70,000 disappear rather than tell his family that warmth had been weaponized against him, and he had felt something settle in his chest that he described to me as the opposite of doubt. Not anger, not satisfaction, just the quiet, absolute certainty of someone who knows they are exactly where they are supposed to be, doing exactly what needs to be done. They came at 7:58. I know the time because Nathan called me while it was happening, standing in the hallway outside his own front door in his socks, and his voice was so steady it almost undid me. He said, "They're inside, Mom. It's happening." I said, "Good." I said, "Go put your shoes on, go outside, get some air." He said, "Yeah." And then there was a silence on the line that was not empty. It was full of 6 weeks of a woman moving her things into his apartment and cooking in his kitchen and saying his name in the particular way she said it that had made him feel, for a while, genuinely chosen. Full of 4 months of a relationship that had been real in the ways that mattered to him and constructed in the ways that mattered to her. Full of a hand squeezed 3 times under a dinner table because some part of him had known before his conscious mind was ready to form the words. He went outside. He got some air. The investigation that followed took 11 weeks to reach its first round of charges. What it revealed was larger than even Sandra had projected on that first morning call. Alicia Drummond had run variations of the same scheme across 3 provinces over 4 years. The Lakeshore Private Capital Fund was one of 3 fraudulent vehicles operating simultaneously under different names with different ghost addresses and different operators in different cities, all connected through Derek Solano's intermediary corporate architecture, all running the same subscription agreement structure with the same missing collateral schedule and the same 72-hour wire transfer language and the same month-end deadline that was not a real deadline, but a pressure mechanism, a manufactured urgency designed to move money before the investor's instinct to verify had time to fully form. Across all documented victims, 14 people in total, once the full scope was established, the losses exceeded $1.3 million. Some of those people had lost retirement savings. Some had lost inheritance money held in trust. One woman, 62 years old, widowed 18 months before Alicia made contact with her through a community investment group in Calgary, had lost $210,000, the entirety of what her husband had left her, and had not told her children because she could not bear the look she imagined seeing on their faces. She was the one that stayed with me longest, not because her loss was the largest, because her silence was the most familiar, because she had done exactly what the widower in Mississauga had done and what every victim before her had done and what the entire architecture of this kind of fraud is specifically designed to produce. She had absorbed the loss into herself and carried it alone and let her shame become the final instrument of her own isolation. Derek Solano was arrested 6 weeks after Alicia. His clean public profile, his registered mortgage brokerage, his real office with real staff, and a real telephone. None of it survived contact with the documented chain that Nathan's recording had initiated. The intermediary corporate structures were traced and mapped. The account network was frozen. The paper trail that had been carefully constructed to resist exactly this kind of pursuit was disassembled the same way it had been built, document by document, transaction by transaction, with the patience and precision that this work has always required and always rewarded. Nathan came for Sunday dinner 3 weeks after the arrest. Just the three of us, him, Ronald, and me, at the same table where 4 months of someone's careful and calibrated deception had come within weeks of paying off completely. Carol made her roast chicken. I made the pot roast. We sat together and we ate, and Nathan was quiet in the way people are quiet after something difficult has finished, and the silence on the other side of it is not absence, but space, room to breathe, room to settle back into the shape of your own life after something has moved through it and rearranged things you didn't know could be rearranged. He helped with the dishes without being asked. He sat across from me afterward with his hands around his coffee mug. And he said, "I keep asking myself how I didn't see it sooner." And I looked at my son, this person I had watched grow from a boy who needed a secret hand signal to escape a boring conversation into a man who had sat across from someone systematically dismantling his future and held himself together long enough to help dismantle hers. And I said, "Nathan, the moment your gut told you something was wrong, you listened. You didn't talk yourself out of it completely. You reached for me. That is the thing that made every other thing possible." He nodded slowly. "Most people don't," I said. "That is the tragedy in these cases. Most people feel the wrongness and convince themselves they are being paranoid. They are embarrassed. They don't want to look foolish. They don't want the relationship to be what it is turning out to be. So they wait. And while they are waiting, the window closes and the money moves and the person is already in a different city, building a different frame for a different painting that will never exist." We sat with the rain against the kitchen window and the sound of a house that was simply, ordinarily itself again. And I thought about the woman in Calgary who had carried $210,000 of loss in silence for 8 months before an investigator knocked on her door and told her she was not alone in it. I thought about what it had cost her to hold that by herself. I thought about what it costs anyone to hold something that heavy without a hand to squeeze back. If there is one thing I want you to take from this, it is not a list of red flags, though the red flags are real and they matter. It is not a warning about unregistered funds or ghost addresses or phantom collateral schedules, though all of those things are worth knowing and worth checking. It is this: if someone you love reaches out to you in whatever way they know how, with whatever signal they have, please listen. Not tomorrow, right now. Because the difference between a family that loses everything and a family that loses nothing is almost never the size of the fraud or the sophistication of the operator. It is almost always one person who felt something was wrong and decided, just barely, just in time, that the feeling was worth more than the embarrassment of being wrong. Tell me something. Has anyone in your life ever sent you a signal you weren't sure how to read? Because I think more people are sitting at that table than any of us realizes.